Welcome to my presentation. Welcome to my presentation on President Trump's actions. President Donald Trump of the United States of America. It's a Thursday here in India, but it's still late Wednesday in the United States of America. A monster rally. The markets, the Dow, the S&P 500, and the Nasdaq 100 all flew into space yesterday with returns above 8%. So what's been happening here? What President Trump did on Wednesday, US time, is that he pressed the pause button on tariffs in the context of those countries exporting goods into the United States of America. That is, US imports from 70-odd countries would have a tariff pause for the next 90 days. But China wasn't included there. The 104% has now been raised to 125% tariff on Chinese exports into the United States of America. So when Americans import, American businesses and American households import goods from China, they would be paying their government. The Americans will be paying the American government a tariff of 125%. In the context of the other countries, it's a tariff of 10%. The reciprocal tariffs will not come into action for the next 90 days. So, welcome to the show. There's been a blowout performance on Wall Street. Absolutely marvelous. But we can explain it. You can classify the world into noisy ignoramuses and wise, deep actors who understand how the global economy works, how the US economy works, and how their own economies work. There are those who understand how the US dollar works, and there are those who think that we still need to have gold to back the dollar. Well, I did tell you that the world can be classified into those who know and those who don't know. Those who don't know can be called ignoramuses, and they keep spinning a lot of yarn. When you don't know the truth, you tend to have a greater amount of conversation ferreting out. You seek truth by uttering absurdities. One of those things is that this has been called a tariff war. Really not. What President Trump has waged or done is deeply thought out with long-term beneficial impact for the United States of America. What President Trump has done has been deeply thought of. This is not a tariff war. The noisy ignoramuses have been calling this a tariff war. How absurd it is. There's a second part. Professor Jeffrey Sachs is a globetrotter, seen to be a knowledgeable gentleman, but I think he's modestly talented. In the recent past hours, he said, America has weaponized the United States dollar. How absurd, absolutely absurd. The United States of America has not weaponized the United States dollar. It's China which has weaponized the United States dollar. And that's the reason why President Trump has taken it upon himself to do what he's doing with a great impact in mind, a great objective in mind, serving the United States of America unequivocally. Absolutely, it's US-centric, and there's no reason why you should suspect Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, of any stupidity. My friend, Professor Scott Galloway, thinks everything that President Trump does is stupid, and actually no, very well thought of. I think Professor Galloway, too, is modestly talented. You need to understand why President Trump is doing what he's doing. To start with, let's go back to the 1970s, February 1972, when President Richard Nixon did a great thing by visiting Beijing, Peking, those days when Mao and Zhao were the bosses of China. Very epochal visit, last week of February 1972. At that time, India had major problems with the United States of America. But Nixon wanted to really shabby up India's face. He went to China, and in 1972, and 10 years before 1972, China had invaded India, the 1962 war. China doesn't really wage war too frequently. China waged war only twice or thrice. The first with India in 1962, another in the COVID year, two between, it waged war against Vietnam. But China is basically very civil, very decently behaved. But when it comes to money, it understands that it's the boss of the world. It's doing what it wants to do. China has weaponized the United States dollar, and I'm going to explain. China has weaponized the United States dollar. We need to tell Professor Jeffrey Sachs that he's incorrect. America has not weaponized the USD, China has. And we have to explain why. And why it's enormously detrimental to what America is and would be in the near future. So Trump's actions are not tariff wars. So President Trump's actions don't deserve to be classified as a tariff war, not at all. It's a war for the future, and President Trump has very courageously done this in the first few months of his second term. I wish President Trump would continue to be there in the third term too. That's just my view. It's up to the people of the United States of America, their Congress and the Constitution to make it possible. It's the business of the citizens, Congress and Constitution of the United States of America to make it possible for President Trump to be there in the third term. It's just my view, but let's continue. So why is China the major objective of everything President Trump does? Now, let me also say this. President Trump knows what he is doing, but he'll throw in a lot of things to confuse people, especially those noisy ignoramuses who walk around as experts. That's to fool them. The second part is he will have so much substance that those who are well-informed, warm-hearted towards the United States of America will find a lot of room to negotiate. And I hope the Indian government will find a lot of room to negotiate with the US administration. Here's my explanation here. After 1972, America didn't hasten to establish diplomatic relationships with China. That was left to President Carter in 1979 to do that. And it began as a lukewarm relationship. China exported goods worth $1 billion in 1979. Only that much. And I think a couple of years ago, China exported about $430 billion goods into the United States of America. And we have had a long history in between. President Clinton established a great pact, a trade agreement with China, thinking that China would import a lot of goods into China from the United States of America. And what we had, of course, was China banning a lot of companies, the tech companies that are the bosses of the world. And what did China do? China banned a whole lot of American companies. Many of America's tech companies cannot operate in mainland China. How absurd it is. So China has been running a one-sided war, a total war, a war for the future with the United States of America. And in between, a lot of other absurdities occurred. In 1989, between April and June, there was the Tiananmen massacre in China. Chinese civilian population were rolled over by tanks, shot. But America forgave all these things. America did not really hold the human rights card against China. America was very generous. America has been very generous. America has been extremely generous to China, despite the bloodbath that took place on the 3rd of June, 1989, in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And yet, China has not really changed. China has been waging a one-sided war, and now I need to say how it works. China exports about $430 billion worth goods, and it imports only so much less, let's say 100, 150, 200. So what does China do with the residual $200 billion? Part of it is invested as US treasuries because mainland China doesn't work. The people of China don't use the USD. For them, it's a CNY, the Chinese yuan, for day-to-day transactions. So the excess dollars that China has by exporting more than it imports is invested in the United States of America as US treasuries. And for those especially who thought that their own currencies would have to be backed by their central bank holding gold and or the United States dollar, I think you are an ignoramus. Absolutely. I'm sorry to say that. To those in my audience who think that their country has to have money, their money in circulation based on how much that country's central bank holds as dollars or as gold, you're an ignoramus. But let's get going here. China invests the residual part of it, but not all of it, in US treasuries, which means that the US has to have a need to borrow this money, and that is where you need to now take paper and pencil and write the second thing. So what China does is it has the surplus, part of it is invested in US treasuries, and the remainder, it has to do something. But before that, we get back to the fiscal deficit. America needs dollars from other countries to finance its fiscal deficit. China, Japan, India, Singapore, Malaysia, the European Union, all these countries have trade surpluses, dollars, which means that these dollars can't be used in their own economies. They have to be given back, invested in the United States of America, because the dollar is America's currency. So they invest in US treasuries. Treasuries are instruments issued by the United States Treasury. They can be bills, notes, and bonds, depending on their tenure, because the US government is borrowing. So the fiscal deficit of the United States of America is the second major thing. America has a trade deficit with a range of countries, of which the number one is China, the second is the European Union. America also has a fiscal deficit. What does it mean here? Americans, companies, citizens pay taxes that are insufficient to support America's spending. That is the reason why President Trump has established DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. And of course, Mr. Elon Musk is at the head of DOGE, going after every cent that can be saved. So there are two things you need to keep in mind. The fiscal deficit of the United States of America, which has to be funded. Therefore, the United States of America issues US treasuries to anybody. You can also fill the deficit by internal savings. But if internal savings are insufficient, you need to have dollars come from elsewhere, USD come from elsewhere. And that is where China, Japan, India, and others have these big loads of US dollars with which they buy US treasury. So two things have to coexist. America's predicament, seriously bad predicament, is a result of two deficits, the fiscal deficit and the trade deficit. And now the fiscal deficit all matters in the context of the cost of capital to the United States of America. Remember the sovereign curve, the sovereign yield curve. If the American government has to borrow at, say, 4%, it means that American companies would be borrowing with a credit spread, 4.1%, 4.5, 5, and 6. And you know how there's a basis, there's a credit spread, and that's how interest rates work. So America's yield curve is actually held by those who subscribe to US treasuries and they live outside the United States of America. And that's what Trump understands very clearly. President Trump understands this very clearly, that the fiscal deficit is also an enemy. The trade deficit is an enemy. America's fiscal deficit is one enemy, major source of a problem. America's trade deficit, another source of a problem. And people are taking advantage of this. Other countries are butchering the United States of America. They have come to weaponize the dollar against the United States of America. And that's the reason why I said Professor Jeffrey Sachs is absurdly wrong. He should have done his homework better. So China is one of those countries that actually runs America's monetary policy. It has weaponized the US dollar, but it goes outside the geography of the United States of America. I'll explain how now. So America has a fiscal deficit year after year, and it's now accumulated to something like $36 trillion accumulated debt. And every year there's an increment. There have been years when America has turned in a fiscal surplus, but very rare. The only way to bring down the burden of debt is to A, reduce the deficit. You keep reducing the deficit, and remember, that's the reason why you have the Department of Government Efficiency, and Mr. Elon Musk is running it. And they've been at work. They've been whittling down the expenditure, the nonsense, the nuisance expenditure. At the same time, President Donald Trump wants to whittle down NATO spending. Maybe the USA and Russia will become friends. And welcome to that, too. It's a good idea. And that's what President Trump says. NATO spending is NATO's problem, and America is not a big beneficiary but spends a whole lot of money. And therefore, President Trump has warmed up, cozied up to President Putin of Russia. Welcome to that. It's a very important development in the story. America is now keen to cut down fiscal deficit. All Americans are very worried that the future, the size of the fiscal deficit will be so big that their own future would be at stake. And they're very right at it. And President Trump is doing everything to whittle down the deficit. That's one part. The second part is you have to whittle down the trade deficit. Otherwise, your currency would become very weak. So the USD has to be strong. The fiscal deficit has to be low. America's recurring payments of interest on debt should reduce, and this would make America great again. So, coming to the trade part of it, it is not an all-out trade war against any enemy. The country which comes up number one on this list, which has huge trade surpluses, has a game plan to keep building this trade surplus, at the same time keep American companies out of China wherever it wishes, orchestrates the monetary policy, every move of the US Federal Reserve, all the interest rate settings, and all the bidding at the primary auctions for government securities. But that's not the story. China has been villainously doing one more thing. Its trade surplus is, say, $100, just a scale. It may use only $20 to $30 to buy US treasuries. The remainder $70 is spent by China in buying up assets in Mexico, Canada, other countries in South America, other countries in Africa. China has been weaponizing the United States dollar to acquire mineral assets, real assets, port assets, manufacturing capabilities in Mexico and Canada. Remember, that's the reason why President Trump said Mexico and Canada, too, are not doing a great job. Their relationship with the USA. That's why President Trump said Mexico and Canada, too, are not the greatest of friends of the United States of America, because China holds manufacturing assets in Mexico, manufacturing assets in Canada, and those countries use their own trade agreements with the USA. So China has weaponized currencies, China has weaponized real assets, China has weaponized trade, and President Trump is now doing what it has to do, or what the American people have to do, to defang the dragon. The entire exercise that President Donald J. Trump has now put into motion is aimed at defanging the dragon. What President Donald J. Trump has done is to defang China. China has been weaponizing the United States dollar for so many years now in a one-sided relationship where n number of companies from America can't operate in China. What China thinks is good for itself, it will allow. So Chinese self-interest has primarily been detrimental to the United States of America. China's undiluted self-interest, unilateral self-interest, pursuit of unilateral self-interest has been totally detrimental to the United States of America. No other president has had the courage to say, I think I have to do what this office, the Oval Office, requires me to do. As the 47th president, this is what I need to do. I'll work on the fiscal deficit, I'll work on the trade deficit. And remember, on Wednesday, when the pause, the tariff pause was announced for 90 days with respect to other countries, China was not included in this pause. 104% has become 125%. So here is my story. This is not a trade war. Don't think in terms of some stupid President Trump trying to monetize gold at Fort Knox. Don't think of stupid Trump, as Professor Scott Galloway of Columbia says, use trade war to make America great again. It's not about the present. It's absolutely about the future. President Trump is working for the future of America, and that's one reason why I think he should have a third term. President Trump being there for the third term is left to the citizens of America, to Congress, the companies, and the Constitution. But I really think that President Trump deserves a third term, for he's had the courage to tell the world that China has weaponized every possible free market, free trade relationship, instruments, institutions to undermine America, The victim of this entire open global system of trade, money, capital has been America. We all think America has put it down there for its own benefit. No, it's been hijacked. China has hijacked the global systems to pursue its own benefits. The time has now come for the United States of America to reclaim everything that's good for the whole world. China has not been acting in the best interest of the whole world. It's been very selfish, extremely belligerent, trying to have naval exercises across, where, threatening Taiwan. It's not been very good. So congratulations and gratitude, statement of gratitude to President Donald J. Trump from G. Ramachandran. I really admire what you're doing, and I think the people of the world need to know what you're doing. All the very best. On to a Thursday market. Wednesday has been a monster rally. The Dow up, S&P 500 up, NASDAQ 100 up, and yield curve shifting downwards. Very good, extremely good. So let's look forward to a great Thursday on Wall Street.